Long before Istanbul became the beating heart of an empire, long before Janissaries marched in gleaming ranks through the valleys of Europe, and centuries before Suleiman's domes glittered above the Bosphorus, there was a land in turmoil. Anatolia, the great peninsula bridging east and west, has always been a prize of civilizations. Rome had ruled here. Byzantium had thrived here. The Seljuks had carved their domains into their rugged mountains and fertile plains. But by the late 13th century, all of these powers lay weakened, fragmented, or in ruin. To understand the rise of the Ottomans, we must first understand the world they were born into. A world of uncertainty, chaos, and opportunity. By the 1200s, the Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome, guardian of Christianity in the East, was a pale reflection of its former self. Once it had commanded the Mediterranean, its emperors sat in marble palaces along the golden shores of Constantinople. But centuries of civil war, economic stagnation, and external threats had left it crippled. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 had been a disaster for Byzantium. Instead of marching to fight Muslims in the Holy Land, Crusaders had turned their swords against Constantinople itself, sacking the city in one of the darkest betrayals of the medieval world. Churches were desecrated, relics looted, treasures carried away to Venice and beyond. The Byzantines regained their city decades later, but they never truly recovered. By the 13th century, Byzantium controlled little beyond Constantinople itself and a patchwork of towns and fortresses across Greece and western Anatolia. Its emperors commanded history's greatest capital, but little else. To its rivals, the empire looked like a wounded, dangerous beast, but dying. If Byzantium represented the dying past, the Seljuk Turks had once seemed to represent the future. Sweeping out of Central Asia in the 11th century, they had crushed Byzantine armies at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, seizing control of most of Anatolia. For centuries, Seljuk sultans ruled from Konya, building a state that blended Persian, Islamic, and Turkic traditions. Caravanserais lined the trade routes, mosques rose in stone and tile, and scholars filled libraries with learning. But then came the Mongols. In the mid-13th century, the thunder of hooves shook the world as Genghis Khan's heirs swept west. The Seljuks were no match for this tide. At the Battle of Kozdag in 1243, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum was shattered by Mongol armies. Anatolia fell under Mongol overlordship. The once proud Seljuks became puppets, their authority hollowed out. In the vacuum, smaller Turkish beyliks, principalities ruled by warlords, sprang up across the land. Each commanded its own warriors, villages, and castles. They fought Byzantines, Mongols, and each other. This was a patchwork Anatolia, fractured, unstable, but brimming with energy. This was the frontier, a place where religions met and collided, where warriors lived by raiding, and where survival was often decided by the sword. In the west, small Turkish emirates pressed against Byzantine lands, constantly testing the borders. To the east, Mongol influence loomed, though their grip was not absolute. Across the Aegean, Venetian and Genoese merchants carved out their own footholds, commanding trade routes. The frontier world shaped the men who lived in it. Here, loyalty was to clan and war band, not distant monarchs. Leaders had to inspire their followers with both courage and vision. Here, Islam was a rallying cry for Ghazi warriors, holy fighters who framed their raids against the Byzantines as acts of faith. Yet pragmatism ruled as well. Alliances shifted, mercenaries fought for whoever paid, and Christians and Muslims sometimes stood side by side against common foes. It was in this frontier world, filled with uncertainty but alive with opportunity, that the Ottomans would emerge. Among the many Turkish beyliks that dotted Anatolia, a few stood out. The Karamanids in central Anatolia, the Germanids in the west, and the beyliks of Aydin and Saruhan along the Aegean. These states often raided Byzantine towns, competed for dominance, and courted alliances with powerful neighbors. But one of the smallest was a principality around Sagat, near the Byzantine frontier. It was led by a man of modest means and obscure origins, Osman, son of Ertugrul. His domain was little more than a collection of villages and grazing lands. It was insignificant compared to the more established Beyliks. And yet, from this tiny seed would grow an empire that dwarfed them all. Why did Osman's small principality succeed where others did not? Part of the answer lies in timing. Byzantium's weakness meant its borderlands were vulnerable. Mongol power in Anatolia, though fearsome, was distant and inconsistent. Trade routes through Anatolia remained vital, and whoever controlled them could grow rich. This was also an age when faith and warfare intertwined. Warriors on the frontier saw themselves as Ghazis, fighting for Islam against infidels. Leaders like Osman drew legitimacy from this identity. But unlike many rivals, Osman also showed pragmatism, forging alliances with neighboring tribes, integrating conquered peoples, and offering stability in an unstable land. The collapse of empires had left Anatolia fragmented, but fragmentation also meant opportunity. Where larger states stumbled, smaller ones could maneuver, adapt, and grow. The late 13th century was a world in transition. Feudal knights still clashed in Europe, but gunpowder was beginning to change warfare. The Mongols dominated the steppes, but their empire was beginning to fracture into khanates. The Mediterranean hummed with trade, Venice and Genoa battling for dominance. The Crusades were fading, but their legacy lingered in the fractured politics of the Near East. Into this world of change and chaos, the Ottomans would be born. And unlike so many of their rivals, they would not vanish into the shifting sands of history. From the outside, it might have seemed unlikely. Byzantium, with its ancient prestige, seemed the natural heir to Anatolia. Larger Turkish beyliks had stronger armies, richer lands, and more established rulers. But history often turns not on size, but on vision. The Ottomans, under Osman and his successors, possessed a vision that stretched beyond mere survival. They saw themselves not just as raiders, but as builders of a lasting state. They forged loyalty not only through the sword, but through law, faith, and opportunity. It was a vision that would carry them far beyond the forests and hills of Anatolia, into the cities of Europe, the deserts of Arabia, and the heart of 3 continents. In the twilight of the 13th century, on the windswept plains of northwestern Anatolia, a frontier world was taking shape. This was a land of villages hemmed in by forests, mountains, and rivers, a place where the collapse of great empires had left behind only fragments of authority. Byzantium still held Constantinople, but its walls enclosed little more than faded grandeur and dwindling power. To the east, the Seljuk state had been broken by Mongol invasions, leaving behind a patchwork of rival lords and faiths. In this shifting landscape, survival meant allegiance to the sword, and every small principality clung to the hope that fortune might favor its people for one more generation. It was here, on this uncertain stage, that Osman appeared. By birth, he commanded little more than a modest principality, a scattering of villages pressed against the Byzantine frontier. But in the uncertain lives of men and their families, stories often rise larger than their beginnings, and Osman became the vessel of one such tale. Around his name, legend gathered like mist in the valleys of Anatolia. One story tells of a dream that came to him in the night. From his chest, so the dream went, sprang a tree, vast and unyielding, whose branches spread to cover the horizon. Its shade reached across the seas. Its roots sank deep into the earth. To his followers, this was no idle vision. It was prophecy, an omen that Osman's house would one day shelter a world beneath its branches. Yet dreams alone do not carve empires. Osman's warriors lived by the rhythm of the raid, striking across the Byzantine frontier, seizing outposts, plundering caravans, and claiming the strongholds that commanded passes and rivers. To his enemies, these were acts of piracy, the opportunism of a border chief. But Osman carried something that many others in his fractured world did not. He had vision, a sense that the chaos of Anatolia could be shaped into order. Each raid was not merely survival, but the planting of roots. Each conquest a step toward permanence. When he captured Bilsik, a modest Byzantine town, he did more than seize walls and market stalls. He created a seat from which his line could grow. His banners, once little more than tribal standards, now fluttered as the insignia of something greater. In that moment, the name Ottoman began its long journey through history, born from a frontier fighter whose reach had just begun to stretch beyond the horizon. After Osman died in 1324, the small principality he left behind faced a crossroads. It might have vanished as so many others did, collapsing into the rivalries of brothers or the ambitions of neighboring lords. But Osman's son Orhan seized this fragile inheritance and transformed it into something durable. Where Osman had been the restless raider, Orhan became the patient builder. The conquest of Bursa in 1326 was his defining achievement. This city, nestled against the slopes of Mount Yaludag, was no mere prize of plunder. It became the Ottomans' first great capital, the place where they crossed the threshold from tribe to state. Bursa's fertile plains fed their armies, its markets brought wealth, and its craftsmen supplied arms and goods. But perhaps most importantly, its very walls and streets gave permanence to Ottoman power. For the first time, the dynasty ruled not from tents but from palaces, not from raiding camps but from mosques and council chambers. Orhan adorned the city with architecture that proclaimed both piety and sovereignty. Mosques rose, madrasas were founded, and caravanserais welcomed merchants from distant lands. To mint coins in his own name was not just an economic act, but a declaration. The Ottomans had moved beyond petty frontier lords. They were becoming rulers in their own right. The frontier, however, remained their lifeblood. From Bursa, Ottoman forces pressed outward, often drawing Christian mercenaries into their service. Raids into Byzantine lands became campaigns of conquest. When they captured Nicaea, Iznik, and Nicomedia, Izmit, two proud cities of the Byzantine past, it was more than expansion. It was the steady encirclement of Constantinople itself. Still, for the moment, the ancient city held on, a ghostly reminder of Roman grandeur surrounded by a rising Turkish power. Yet the Ottomans did not confine themselves to Anatolia. In the mid-14th century, they crossed the narrow waters of the Dardanelles, establishing a foothold in Europe. For centuries, the Balkans had been a battleground of Slavs, Bulgars, Serbs, Hungarians, and Byzantines. Now, into this fractured landscape came the Ottomans, with their disciplined cavalry and their vision of conquest. When they captured Adrianople in 1369, renaming it Edirne, they established not only a European capital, but a second heart for their empire. From Edirne, Ottoman armies struck into Thrace, Macedonia, and Bulgaria. These were not swift raids, but deliberate conquests, cemented by systems of governance. Villages paid taxes, local elites were co-opted, and lands were redistributed to Ottoman Sipahi cavalry. The frontier was turning into a province, and Europe itself into an Ottoman domain. It was under Murad I that the machinery of empire began to take shape. He formalized institutions of rule, creating a central administration that stretched across two continents. But his most enduring legacy was the establishment of the Devshirme system. Christian boys, taken from their families in the Balkans, were converted, educated, and trained for service to the Sultan. Some became janissaries, soldiers whose discipline and loyalty were unmatched. Others entered the imperial court, rising to positions of great influence as administrators, scholars, or viziers. This system, both admired and feared, ensured that the empire's backbone was not built upon fractious tribal loyalties, but upon the direct service of those shaped from childhood for the state. Murad also tested Ottoman strength in the crucible of battle. In 1389, at Kosovo, Ottoman forces clashed with a Serbian-led coalition. Though the battle ended with Murad's death at the hands of an assassin, the Ottomans held the field, and Serbia fell under their shadow. For the Christian kingdoms of the Balkans, the rise of the Ottomans was no longer a distant rumor. It was a present and pressing threat. Murad's son Bayezid inherited not just his throne, but his momentum. Known as Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, Bayezid moved with a speed and ferocity that stunned friend and foe alike. He crushed armies in Anatolia, subdued Bulgaria, and pressed into Hungary. By 1396, when a great crusading force of knights and soldiers from across Europe marched to confront him at Nicopolis, Bayezid met them with devastating effect. The Crusader host was shattered, and Europe trembled at the thought that the Ottomans might advance unchecked toward the Danube and beyond. Yet the story of empires is rarely one of unbroken ascent. In 1402, Bayezid faced Timur, the conqueror from Central Asia whose empire rivaled that of Genghis Khan. At Ankara, the two powers collided. Timur's cavalry, hardened from campaigns across Persia and India, outmaneuvered the Ottomans. Bayezid's armies were broken, his authority destroyed. Captured and humiliated, Bayezid died in captivity, and his realm was fractured. The Ottoman state entered what came to be known as the Interregnum, a decade of civil war between Bayezid's sons. Rival claimants split the empire, aligning with neighboring powers, hiring mercenaries, and turning brother against brother. Many believed the Ottomans would dissolve, their brief rise snuffed out like so many Turkish beyliks before them. The Byzantines, watching from Constantinople, rejoiced, believing their old enemy had finally fallen to ruin. But the dynasty endured. From the chaos rose Mehmed II, who by 1413 had reasserted control and reunited the Ottoman lands. His rule restored stability, setting the stage for his son Murad II to once again expand into the Balkans, and for his grandson Mehmed II to attempt what none before him had accomplished: the capture of Constantinople itself. The passage from Orhan's modest principality to Mehmed I's restored dominion reveals not simply military conquest, but the forging of a system, cities to serve as capitals, institutions to bind peoples together, armies drawn not from tribal loyalty, but from enforced service, and rulers willing to rebuild even after catastrophe. It was a transformation from frontier raiders to architects of empire, and the Ottomans, having survived their first great trial, were now prepared to seize a prize that would echo through all of history. In the spring of 1453, all eyes turned to a city that had once ruled the known world. Constantinople, the jewel of Byzantium, had stood for more than 1,000 years as the bastion of Christendom in the East. From its towering walls, emperors had once commanded the armies of Rome. Its domes and palaces proclaimed a heritage stretching back to Constantine himself. But now, that once mighty city was reduced to a pale shadow of its past. Its empire had dwindled to little more than the city itself, a few islands, and scattered outposts clinging to survival. Inside its walls lived perhaps 50,000 souls, surrounded by the advancing tide of Ottoman power. The man who now stood before those ancient walls was barely 21 years old. Mehmed II, son of Murad II, had inherited not only a throne but an obsession. For generations, the Ottomans had circled Constantinople like wolves around a wounded prey. Raids, sieges, and blockades had tested its defenses but never breached them. The walls of Theodosius, built in the 5th century, were legendary. Layers of stone and earthworks that had withstood Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and Rus. They were said to be impregnable, but Mehmed believed otherwise. From the first days of his reign, he prepared for this moment. He gathered architects and engineers, men skilled in the new science of artillery. In the town of Edirne, giant bronze cannons were cast, some so massive they required teams of oxen and hundreds of men to move. These weapons were unlike anything Europe had yet seen. Siege guns capable of hurling stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds against the strongest walls in Christendom. When Mehmed marched, he brought with him an army that some chroniclers claimed numbered over 100,000. Janissaries in their white felt caps, Sipahi cavalry with their lances and bows, contingents from Anatolia, and the Balkans engineers, sappers, and fleets of supply wagons. From the sea, his navy blockaded the Bosphorus, cutting the city off from aid. Inside Constantinople, the defenders were few. The Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, a man of courage but limited means, commanded perhaps 7,000 soldiers. Among them were Greek citizens, a small contingent of Genoese under Giovanni Giustiniani, and a scattering of foreign volunteers. They stood against an army many times their number, manning walls that stretched for miles. Yet they held firm, determined that the city of Constantine would not fall without a fight. The siege began in April. For weeks, the thunder of cannon shook the ground, sending tremors through stone that had stood for centuries. Great breaches were torn in the outer walls, hastily repaired each night by desperate defenders. The Bosphorus became a battlefield as Venetian and Genoese ships clashed with Ottoman galleys. In one audacious maneuver, Mehmed ordered his ships hauled overland on greased logs, bypassing the chain that blocked the Golden Horn. When dawn broke, the Byzantines awoke to find Ottoman ships floating where none should have been. Day after day, the city endured. Priests led processions through the streets, relics were carried to the ramparts, and hymns echoed beneath the great dome of Hagia Sophia. Hope flickered that reinforcements from the west might yet arrive. But Christendom was divided, its kings and princes unwilling or unable to march in time. The city stood alone. On the night of May 28th, a final service was held in Hagia Sophia. Greeks and Latins, long divided by schism, prayed together for deliverance. Then the emperor rode to the walls to take his place among the defenders. At dawn on May 29th, the assault began. Waves of Ottoman soldiers surged forward, first irregulars, then Anatolian troops, and finally the Janissaries themselves. Cannon fire roared, ladders clattered against stone, and the air was filled with cries and smoke. For hours, the defenders held, but in the chaos of the fighting, a small gate was left unguarded. Ottoman soldiers forced their way inside, opening a path for the tide that followed. The defenders collapsed. Constantine XI, the last emperor of Byzantium, is said to have thrown aside his purple cloak and charged into the melee, vanishing in the press of battle, never to be seen again. By noon, the banner of the crescent flew over the towers of Constantinople. Mehmed entered the city in triumph, riding through streets strewn with ruin and silence. When he reached Hagia Sophia, he dismounted, walked inside, and ordered it converted into a mosque. What had been the greatest church in Christendom now became the heart of Ottoman Istanbul. The fall of Constantinople was more than the end of a city. It was the end of Byzantium, the last remnant of the Roman Empire that had endured for over a millennium. It was the birth of a new imperial capital that would dominate the eastern Mediterranean for centuries. Across Europe, the news spread like shockwaves. To some, it was the final catastrophe, the fall of the bastion that had long shielded Christendom from the east. To others, it was a call to arms, a warning that a new power had arisen whose ambitions might stretch beyond the Bosphorus and into the very heart of Europe. In Constantinople's fall, the medieval world gave way to the modern. The Ottoman Empire had claimed its greatest prize, and from its new capital, it would look outward with fresh ambition toward the Balkans, toward the Mediterranean, and toward the far horizons of empire. In the years that followed the fall of Constantinople, the world watched with awe and dread as a new empire rose upon the ashes of Byzantium. From his seat in Istanbul, Sultan Mehmed II, soon to be known as the Conqueror, set out to fashion a dominion that would rival the greatest empires of antiquity. The city he had seized became not merely a prize of war, but the heart of a new order. He repopulated its empty quarters with Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and Turks, drawing people from across his domains. The shattered churches and deserted markets once more thrummed with life. Mehmed envisioned not only a capital, but a world city, the hub of a realm that stretched across continents. The transformation was swift and deliberate. The walls that had withstood centuries of sieges were repaired and strengthened. Palaces rose where ruin had stood. The Hagia Sophia, stripped of its relics and icons, was reborn as the Grand Mosque of the Sultans. Minarets pierced the skyline beside the old domes of Byzantium, a declaration that the city had entered a new age. Where once it had been the bulwark of Christendom, Constantinople became Istanbul, the seat of Islam's most formidable dynasty. But Mehmed's ambition did not end at the Bosphorus. The conquest of Constantinople was not his culmination, it was his beginning. From this base, he cast his gaze westward to the Balkans and eastward to Anatolia, determined to bind the disparate territories of the Ottomans into a single, unyielding empire. The armies that had breached the Theodosian walls marched onward, taking Moria in Greece, pressing against Hungary, and pushing into Serbia and Bosnia. Fortress after fortress fell, and with each victory, the Sultan tightened his grip on southeastern Europe. The scale of his conquests unnerved Christian rulers across the continent. Popes thundered for crusade, yet their words found little unity. Venice, Genoa, and the kingdoms of the West watched with unease, but rivalries kept them divided. Meanwhile, Ottoman banners advanced steadily, the Janissaries cutting through enemies with the discipline of a war machine forged in fire. Even at sea, Mehmed sought to expand. The Ottoman navy, strengthened after the lessons of Constantinople, grew into a force capable of challenging the great maritime republics. Islands in the Aegean fell under his control, their harbors serving as stepping stones into the Mediterranean. The empire's reach extended outward like a tide, lapping at the shores of Italy and North Africa, reshaping the balance of power across the region. Yet Mehmed was more than a conqueror of cities and territories. He was a ruler who understood the power of symbols, culture, and legitimacy. In his palaces, he gathered scholars, artists, and jurists from across his lands. He ordered the compilation of laws to bind his diverse subjects together, laws that blended Islamic tradition with the pragmatism of empire. Under his rule, Istanbul became not just the capital of a state, but the center of a civilization, a meeting place where East and West, Islam and Christendom, commerce and culture intertwined. The world began to recognize that a new power had emerged, one not content with survival or defense, but with expansion and dominance. The fall of Constantinople had ended an empire of the past. In its place, a rising Ottoman state would now stand astride continents, controlling the crossroads of trade and faith of Europe and Asia. To those in the West, this shift was both terrifying and transformative. The trade routes that had once passed through Byzantium now flowed into Ottoman hands. Merchants sought new paths around their empire, quests that would send explorers sailing westward into the Atlantic and eventually across oceans to lands unknown. The rise of the Ottomans pushed Europe outward, indirectly igniting an age of exploration. But in the immediate years, it was the presence of this unstoppable new empire that dominated Europe's fears. As Mehmed II secured his throne and looked toward Rome itself as a possible prize, whispers spread that Christendom faced an enemy unlike any it had known before, one armed with gunpowder, discipline, and unrelenting ambition. The Roman Empire, in its eastern form, had perished. In its place, Another empire now claimed the mantle of universal dominion. The Ottomans, heirs not of Constantine but of conquest, had stepped onto the stage as a world power. And their story was only just beginning. By the 16th century, the Ottomans stood astride 3 continents, and into this world was born the ruler who would be remembered as the empire's brightest star, Suleiman. To his subjects, he was canon, i.e. lawgiver, for his codification of justice that ordered the lives of millions. To the west, he was Suleiman the Magnificent, whose name carried both fear and fascination, a monarch whose armies seemed unstoppable, whose court glimmered with wealth and ceremony, and whose reign would mark the high point of Ottoman power. When Suleiman ascended the throne in 1520, he inherited from his father Selim a realm vast and volatile. The Anatolian heartlands were secure, and Constantinople, now Istanbul, throbbed as the beating heart of an empire. Yet challenges pressed from every horizon. To the north, Hungary stood as the bulwark of Christendom, its fortresses defending the Danube. To the east, the Safavid Empire of Persia, followers of Sharia Islam, threatened the Ottomans not only militarily but spiritually, undermining their claim as leaders of the Muslim world. To the south, the Mamluks had been vanquished, but Egypt and the holy cities required steady rule to be bound into the Ottoman fold. Suleiman faced a realm both immense in promise and fragile in unity. His response was swift and decisive. Barely a year into his reign, his army swept into Hungary. At the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, Ottoman cannons and Janissary discipline tore apart the Hungarian host. In a matter of hours, a kingdom that had stood for centuries collapsed. Its king lay dead upon the field, and the gates of Central Europe yawned open. The shock of Mohacs reverberated across Christendom. For the first time, Vienna itself seemed vulnerable, and with it the heart of Europe. Suleiman marched onward, pressing to the very walls of Vienna in 1529. Though weather, logistics, and stubborn defenders thwarted him, the message was unmistakable. The Ottomans were no longer confined to the fringes of Europe. They stood at its center, a force that emperors and popes alike would have to reckon with. But Suleiman's ambitions were not only westward. He turned his gaze to the east, where the Safavids defied his authority. Campaigns into Persia were brutal, waged across mountains and deserts, but they underscored the Ottomans' determination to assert supremacy over rival interpretations of Islam. Control of Iraq and Mesopotamia placed Baghdad in Ottoman hands, strengthening both their political and religious standing. From Mecca to Medina, from Jerusalem to Damascus, Suleiman could present himself as the guardian of Islam's most sacred sites, the shadow of God upon earth. On the seas, too, his reign reshaped the balance of power. The Ottoman fleet, commanded by men like Hayreddin Barbarossa, dominated the eastern Mediterranean. The once proud navies of Venice and Genoa found themselves outmatched, their islands and ports falling into Ottoman hands. Barbarossa's victories extended Ottoman influence as far as Algiers, bringing the North African coast under imperial sway. From the western Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, the Ottomans challenged Portuguese, Spanish, and Italian fleets, competing for the arteries of global trade. Yet for all his conquests, Suleiman's greatness was not measured only by the sword. In Istanbul, his reign saw a flowering of art, architecture, and law. The empire's wealth poured into the capital, funding the construction of mosques whose domes rivaled the heavens. Chief among these was the Suleimani Mosque, built by his great architect Sinan, whose genius reshaped the skyline of the city. With its soaring minarets and harmonious proportions, it stood as a testament not only to Ottoman engineering, but to Suleiman's vision of a just and ordered realm. Law became his second weapon of empire. Where conquest brought lands into his grasp, law bound them together. He streamlined the empire's patchwork of customs and edicts into a codified system, balancing Sharia with the practical needs of governance. In doing so, he earned the title Kanuni the Lawgiver. For subjects from Hungary to Yemen, from the Danube to the Nile, this codification offered predictability and fairness, binding together a realm of Christians, Jews, and Muslims under the canopy of a single imperial order. In his court, magnificence was not an empty word. Diplomats from Venice, France, and England marveled at the splendor of ceremonies, the precision of protocol, and the wealth on display. His harem, overseen by the formidable Hurrem Sultan, known in the West as Roxolana, became a center not only of intrigue but of influence. Hurrem, once a captive, rose to become Suleiman's wife and advisor, reshaping the politics of the dynasty and setting precedents that would reverberate long after his death. Yet even the height of empire carries within it the seeds of fragility. The long wars strained resources. The Janissaries, loyal yet increasingly privileged, began to exert influence that would in time erode the foundations of discipline. Rivalries at court simmered, and succession would always remain the shadow over Ottoman stability. Still, in the mid-16th century, none could deny that the Ottomans had reached their zenith. Their empire stretched from Budapest to Baghdad, from the Caspian to Algiers, from the Red Sea to the gates of Vienna. They commanded the richest trade routes of the Old World, guarded Islam's holiest cities, and stood as arbiters of law and culture for tens of millions of people. To their enemies, they were a storm at the edge of Europe, a threat that demanded endless vigilance. To their subjects, they were the bearers of order in a fractured world. And to history, they would be remembered as one of the most formidable empires ever to rise upon the earth. Their power crystallized in the reign of one man, Suleiman the Magnificent, under whom the Ottoman Empire reached its golden age. The grandeur of Suleiman's reign did not fade overnight, but in the quiet years after his death, shadows began to lengthen across the Ottoman world. For centuries, the empire had risen on the momentum of conquest, each victory opening the way for another, each frontier feeding the hunger of the state. Yet as the 16th century gave way to the 17th, the conditions that had nourished the empire began to change. The Ottomans, once the restless predators of the frontier, now found themselves the masters of a realm so vast that its very size threatened to overwhelm it. The first cracks appeared within the palace itself. The system of succession that had once produced rulers hardened by struggle began to falter. Earlier sultans had fought brothers and rivals, proving their strength in blood before seizing the throne. Now, to prevent endless civil wars, younger princes were confined within the palace, raised in a cloistered seclusion known as the caves, the cage. Cut off from the world, they grew into rulers often unprepared for the burdens of power, their lives shaped less by experience than by intrigue. In their place, court officials, viziers, and palace women increasingly steered the affairs of state. The Janissaries, too, once the backbone of Ottoman might, evolved into something more fragile. This elite corps, drawn originally from Christian youths converted to Islam through the Devshirme levy, had been trained to embody absolute loyalty and discipline. But as generations passed, their privileges grew and their autonomy expanded. No longer the austere soldiers of earlier centuries, the Janissaries now demanded concessions, interfered in politics, and defended their hereditary rights. They became both indispensable and dangerous, a power within the empire that rulers could not ignore, yet could no longer fully control. Externally, the world was shifting beneath the empire's feet. For centuries, the Ottomans had controlled the arteries of trade that linked Europe with Asia. Spices, silks, and treasures had flowed through their ports, filling their coffers and sustaining their armies. But as Portuguese and Spanish sailors rounded the Cape of Good Hope and crossed the Atlantic, new trade routes began to bypass Ottoman lands. Wealth poured instead into the ports of Lisbon, Seville, and eventually Amsterdam and London. The empire's central position, once its greatest asset, began to lose its value. Wars, too, grew costlier and less decisive. The Ottoman advance into Europe, which had seemed unstoppable under Suleiman, slowed and faltered. The long war with the Habsburgs sapped resources, while battles against Persia bled the empire's strength in the east. Victories were still won, and the Ottomans remained a formidable power, but the momentum of expansion had stalled. In 1571, at Lepanto, an alliance of Christian powers shattered the Ottoman fleet in one of the largest naval battles of the age. Though the empire rebuilt its ships quickly, the battle marked a turning point. Europe was learning to resist, to match the Ottomans blow for blow. Yet decline was not simply a story of military defeats or economic shifts. It was also a matter of perception. For centuries, Europe had looked east with dread, imagining the Ottomans as an unstoppable juggernaut. But as European states strengthened, as new technologies and financial systems emerged in the West, that image began to fade. The Ottomans, once feared as conquerors, were increasingly regarded as stagnant, their once feared armies lagging behind the innovations of gunpowder warfare and naval artillery. Inside the empire, discontent simmered. Provincial governors, once loyal administrators, grew semi-independent, carving out power in the far corners of the realm. Peasant revolts erupted in Anatolia, fueled by heavy taxation and the hardships of war. The sense of unity that had carried the Ottomans from their frontier origins was strained as never before. And yet, even in this era of strain and difficulty, the empire endured. Its cities still flourished, its markets thrived, its courts dispensed justice. Istanbul remained one of the greatest cities in the world, its skyline dominated by domes and minarets, its streets alive with traders and scholars. The empire's decline was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, uneven erosion, a transformation that would take centuries. The Ottomans had risen by harnessing the currents of their age, the weakness of Byzantium, the disunity of Europe, the trade routes of the Old World. As those currents shifted, the empire faced new realities. The story of the 17th century was no longer one of relentless conquest, but of adaptation and survival, an empire struggling to sustain its greatness in a world that was leaving it behind. This was the beginning of the long Ottoman decline, a decline that would not be swift nor simple, but which would unfold across generations, reshaping not only the empire itself, but the world that had grown up in its shadow. By the dawn of the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer the unstoppable juggernaut it had once been. What had begun with Osman's dream and reached its zenith under Suleiman was now a state whose energies were drained by the weight of its own dominion. Yet the Ottomans did not collapse overnight. They entered instead a long twilight, an age of slow decline, in which the very institutions that had once propelled their ascent began to corrode from within. At the heart of this transformation lay the Janissaries. For centuries, they had been the Sultan's most loyal servants, men without family ties or hereditary claims, bound to the state alone. But by the 17th century, this system had shifted. The levy of Christian boys that had once fed the core had dwindled, and the ranks of the Janissaries filled instead with the sons of Janissaries themselves. What had been an elite force of disciplined warriors became a privileged guild, its members more concerned with protecting their income and influence than serving in battle. They engaged in trade, ran shops, and interfered in politics. When sultans sought to reform them, they resisted violently, toppling viziers and even unseating rulers. The empire that had once drawn its strength from the loyalty of these men now found itself at their mercy. The corruption of the Janissaries was mirrored elsewhere. Provincial governors, tasked with upholding the Sultan's law, increasingly turned their offices into private fiefdoms. Tax farming, a system meant to ensure revenue for the treasury, was abused to enrich local elites at the expense of peasants, who shouldered unbearable burdens. In Anatolia, whole villages were abandoned as farmers fled their lands, unable to endure the demands placed upon them. Waves of rebellion known as the Salali uprisings swept across the countryside, shaking the empire's foundations and reminding Istanbul of the fragility of its control. On the frontiers, too, the Ottoman machine showed its limits. The 17th century saw wars fought against Austria, Poland, Venice, and Persia, each conflict draining the empire of soldiers and treasure. The Siege of Vienna in 1683 revealed the sharp contrast between past triumphs and present realities. Once the Ottomans had thundered across Europe, threatening the very heart of Christendom. Now their armies were repelled, their retreat turning into a rout. The defeat at Vienna marked more than the loss of a campaign. It was the loss of an era, the end of Ottoman expansion into Europe. In the decades that followed, treaties stripped the empire of territories it had once considered secure. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 forced the Ottomans to cede Hungary and large swaths of the Balkans. It was the first time the empire had been forced to surrender significant lands to European powers, and it set a precedent that would repeat itself across the following centuries. Each treaty, each lost province, chipped away at the aura of invincibility that had once defined the Ottoman name. Meanwhile, Europe itself was changing in ways the Ottomans struggled to match. The scientific revolution, advances in artillery, the rise of disciplined standing armies, and new financial systems gave European states a growing edge. Ottoman armies, still formidable, found themselves increasingly outclassed. The empire's bureaucratic machinery, which had once been a marvel of adaptability, ossified. Attempts at reform ran into resistance from entrenched elites, religious scholars, and janissaries alike. Yet decline did not mean irrelevance. Even in its weakened state, the Ottoman Empire remained one of the largest and most diverse realms on earth. Its capital, Istanbul, continued to be a glittering metropolis, home to scholars, poets, merchants, and artisans. Pilgrims traveled through its lands on their way to Mecca, and caravans carried goods across its markets. The empire's cultural influence remained immense, its mosques and palaces testifying to centuries of wealth and power. But beneath the surface, the empire's problems deepened. Fiscal crises became chronic, debts mounted, and the state leaned ever more heavily on taxation and borrowing. The balance of power that had once favored the Ottomans tilted decisively toward Europe. No longer did European diplomats treat the empire as an existential threat. Instead, they began to see it as a patient in decline, a once mighty adversary now stumbling into weakness. By the close of the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire stood at a crossroads. It still commanded vast lands, stretching from the Balkans to the Arabian deserts, from the Black Sea to the Nile. It still possessed armies, fleets, and the prestige of 6 centuries of rule. But the aura of inevitability that had once surrounded its rise had dissipated. The empire was now entering an age where its survival would be shaped not by expansion, but by endurance, a slow struggle to preserve what remained in the face of mounting pressures from within and without. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by conquest, but by decline. The Janissaries, once the instrument of Ottoman power, now symbolized its decay. The frontiers that had once fed its expansion now revealed its vulnerability. And Europe, once cowed by the shadow of the Crescent, now began to see an opportunity to press, to probe, and to divide. The Ottomans were not yet finished, but their golden age was gone. What lay ahead was a long struggle to adapt to a world that was moving beyond them, a struggle that would ultimately test the very survival of the empire itself. The Ottomans had risen first as a power of the land, their armies pressing across the Balkans, Anatolia, and the deserts of the Middle East. But by the 16th century, their gaze turned seaward. For centuries, the Mediterranean had been the heart of the known world, a crossroads where East and West met in trade, war, and faith. Whoever controlled its waters could dominate the arteries of commerce, dictate the fate of empires, and project power across continents. The Ottomans, with their capital at Istanbul commanding the Bosphorus and the Black Sea, understood that their destiny was now tied to the sea. The rise of Ottoman naval power was personified in a single name, Hayreddin Barbarossa. Born on the island of Lesbos, the son of a potter, he and his brother began their careers as corsairs, raiding Christian shipping in the Aegean. But where others remained pirates, Barbarossa rose higher. His daring and skill at sea drew the attention of Sultan Suleiman, who recognized in him not a marauder but a weapon. Appointed admiral of the Ottoman fleet, Barbarossa transformed what had been a regional navy into a Mediterranean powerhouse. Under his command, the Ottoman flag flew across the Aegean, the Ionian, and the Tyrrhenian seas. North Africa, once contested by Spain, fell under Ottoman influence as corsair cities like Algiers and Tunis became vassals of the Sultan. Spanish ships were hunted, Venetian galleys outmatched, and coastal towns across Italy and the western Mediterranean trembled at the sight of Ottoman sails. In 1538, at the Battle of Preveza, Barbarossa's fleet shattered a combined armada of Venice, Spain, and the Papal States. For the next 3 decades, Ottoman dominance of the eastern Mediterranean was uncontested. But the Mediterranean was never a quiet sea. As the Ottomans expanded, European powers responded with coalitions of their own. Venice, once a rival but also a trading partner, resisted the loss of its ports and islands. Spain, enriched by silver from the New World, poured resources into its fleets, determined to defend its holdings in Italy and the western Mediterranean. And the papacy, still envisioning itself as the defender of Christendom, rallied states into leagues meant to check Ottoman power. Despite this resistance, the Ottomans continued to extend their reach. The conquest of Cyprus in 1571 dealt a severe blow to Venetian prestige, handing the empire another jewel in the eastern Mediterranean. Yet this triumph would be swiftly overshadowed. Later that same year, off the coast of Greece, the Ottoman fleet met the assembled navy of the Holy League, a coalition of Spain, Venice, and other Christian states, in a clash that would echo through history. The Battle of Lepanto was one of the largest naval encounters of the early modern age. More than 400 ships, carrying tens of thousands of men, fought in a struggle that raged for hours across the Gulf of Patras. The sound of cannon fire shook the sea, galleys collided in chaos, and men fought hand to hand on bloodied decks. By the day's end, the Ottomans had suffered a devastating defeat. Their fleet was shattered, tens of thousands of sailors and soldiers dead or captured, and the myth of their naval invincibility broken. For Europe, Lepanto became a moment of triumph, celebrated in paintings, poems, and chronicles. It was hailed as proof that the tide of Ottoman advance could be stopped. For the Ottomans, the defeat was sobering but not fatal. Within a year, they had rebuilt their fleet, launching new galleys into the Aegean and continuing their campaigns. Yet the balance of the Mediterranean had shifted. The empire could no longer claim undisputed supremacy. The sea that had seemed poised to become an Ottoman lake was now contested, its currents turning increasingly toward Europe. Beyond the Mediterranean, even greater changes were underway. Portuguese and Spanish ships had already sailed beyond the Straits of Gibraltar, circumnavigating Africa and crossing the Atlantic. Trade routes that once funneled wealth through Ottoman ports now shifted to Lisbon, Seville, and eventually Amsterdam and London. Spices from Asia, gold and silver from the Americas, and slaves from Africa all began to enrich European powers in ways the Ottomans could not rival. While Barbarossa and his successors fought to secure the Old Sea, a new world was being opened, one that would steadily eclipse the Mediterranean in global importance. Still, the Ottomans remained a maritime power for centuries. Their fleets patrolled the Black Sea, their corsairs harried European shipping, and their naval bases in Algiers and Tunis remained thorns in the side of Spain. Yet the empire's failure to dominate the Atlantic and Indian Oceans marked a limitation of its vision. The Ottomans had mastered the sea of antiquity, but did not seize the oceans of the modern age. The story of the Ottoman Empire at sea is thus one of both triumph and loss, an era of dominance under Barbarossa and Suleiman, crowned with victories like Preveza, yet shadowed by disasters like Lepanto. It is the tale of an empire that commanded the old world's waters, but watched as new horizons opened beyond its reach. In the end, the Mediterranean remained contested ground, a stage upon which the Ottomans fought valiantly but could never secure absolute mastery. And so the empire turned once more to the land, facing the slow pressures of European rivals, the strains of internal decay, and the relentless demands of holding together a realm that stretched across continents. The sea had offered glory, but it had also revealed limits. The true struggle of the Ottomans would be fought not on the waves, but in the heart of their empire itself. The 17th century opened with the Ottomans still formidable, their empire stretching from the gates of Vienna to the mountains of Persia, from the deserts of Arabia to the coasts of North Africa. Yet beneath the grandeur, cracks were beginning to show. The machinery of conquest, which had once propelled their armies across continents, was slowing. The balance of power, so long in their favor, began to tilt. The empire that had humbled Byzantium, Venice, and Hungary now faced a Europe that was changing, richer, more centralized, and increasingly armed with weapons of finance and technology that the Ottomans struggled to match. The battlefield where this shift became most visible was Central Europe. Twice, in 1529 and again in 1683, the Ottomans marched upon Vienna, the symbolic heart of the Habsburg lands and the gateway to Western Europe. The first attempt had ended in frustration, foiled by weather, disease, and stubborn resistance. More than a century later, in the summer of 1683, the Sultan's armies tried again. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha led a massive force northward, laying siege to the city. For weeks, Ottoman cannon battered Vienna's walls while miners tunneled beneath its defenses. Hunger and desperation spread within the city, while the crescent banners of the empire flew proudly outside. But Europe was no longer the fractured patchwork it had once been. The Habsburgs called for aid, and a coalition answered. Poles, Bavarians, Saxons, and other allies rallied under the command of King Jan Sobieski of Poland. On September 12th, Sobieski led a daring cavalry charge down the Kahlenberg Hills, crashing into the Ottoman lines. The siege collapsed in chaos, and Kara Mustafa's army retreated in disarray. What had promised to be a crowning triumph of Ottoman expansion became, instead, a humiliating defeat. The failure at Vienna was not merely a military loss. It was a turning point. The empire that had once seemed unstoppable was now clearly vulnerable. European powers sensed the change, and they moved swiftly to exploit it. In the years that followed, the Ottomans faced a series of defeats in the so-called Great Turkish War. The battles of Mohacs and Zinta, fought against Habsburg and Allied forces, ended in crushing reversals. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 forced the Ottomans, for the first time in their history, to surrender large territories in Europe. Hungary, Transylvania, and parts of Croatia slipped from their grasp, marking the beginning of a long retreat. These defeats reflected more than bad luck. They revealed structural weaknesses in the empire itself. The Janissaries, once the sharp edge of Ottoman arms, had grown corrupt and resistant to reform. Their discipline had decayed, their loyalty fractured, and they increasingly resisted modernization. At the same time, the sultans themselves seemed diminished. Where Suleiman had been a statesman and a conqueror, Many of his successors preferred the safety of the palace to the uncertainty of campaign. The vast bureaucracy of the empire, swollen with officials and weighed down by intrigue, became slow to adapt. Meanwhile, the currents of global power continued to shift. European navies dominated the oceans, carrying goods and wealth from the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The trade routes that once enriched Ottoman cities were now bypassed by ships that sailed directly from India to London, from the Caribbean to Seville. Istanbul remained a magnificent capital, but its centrality in the world's commerce was fading. The 17th century also saw the empire buffeted by internal strains. Rebellions broke out among provincial governors, soldiers mutinied over unpaid wages, and rural uprisings, the so-called Salali revolts, devastated Anatolia. Plague, famine, and war combined to sap the vitality of the population. The treasury, drained by constant campaigns, struggled to keep pace with the rising costs of gunpowder warfare and a standing army. What had once been a state defined by expansion now found itself fighting desperately to preserve its borders. And yet, even in decline, the Ottomans remained formidable. Their armies could still muster hundreds of thousands of men. Their cities still thrived with culture and trade, and their courts still commanded respect and fear. But the trajectory had shifted. No longer was the question how far the Ottomans could advance. It was now how long they could endure. By the dawn of the 18th century, the empire stood at a crossroads. Its enemies were emboldened, its strengths fraying, its weaknesses exposed. The failure at Vienna had set in motion a long retreat, one that could not be easily reversed. The Ottoman Empire, once the terror of Europe, was now entering an age not of conquest, but of survival. The 18th century dawned on an empire that was no longer feared as it once had been. The Ottomans still commanded vast lands stretching across 3 continents, controlling holy cities and ruling over millions. But the illusion of invincibility had been shattered. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 marked the first time they ceded large swathes of territory in Europe, and it was a wound that never truly healed. The empire, which had once expanded endlessly outward, now faced a new reality. The world was changing faster than it could adapt. For centuries, the Ottomans had defined themselves through conquest. Now they entered an age of preservation. On every frontier, they were pressed by enemies who had learned their tactics, matched their armies, and surpassed their technology. In the north, Russia rose under the leadership of Peter the Great and later Catherine. No longer a distant threat confined to the steppes, Russia emerged as a great power whose ambitions pointed directly toward Ottoman lands. To the west, Austria and the Habsburgs strengthened their grip on Central Europe. In the east, Persia remained a perennial rival. The empire was ringed by ambitious powers, and with each passing decade, the Ottomans found it harder to hold them at bay. Wars with Russia defined much of the 18th century. Again and again, Ottoman and Russian armies clashed along the Black Sea, in the Balkans, and across the Caucasus. The Ottomans fought to keep control of their northern frontier, but each war drained them, and each treaty chipped away at their dominance. Russia's warm water ambitions, its drive to secure ports on the Black Sea and access to the Mediterranean, meant that the Ottomans were locked in an existential struggle. The Treaty of Kukuk-Kainarka in 1774 marked one of the most devastating blows. Not only did it grant Russia territory, but it also gave the Tsars the right to claim a role as protectors of Orthodox Christians within the empire. It was a dangerous precedent. The internal diversity that had once been a source of Ottoman strength mosaic of faiths, and peoples living under the Sultaness' rule could now be exploited by foreign powers. The empire's internal fabric was fraying as well. Provinces that once submitted readily to Istanbul's authority grew more independent. In Egypt, the Mamluks wielded power with near autonomy, paying only lip service to the Sultan. In the Arabian Peninsula, The rise of the Wahhabi movement, allied with the Saud family, posed both a religious and political challenge to Ottoman authority. Even within the Balkans, local notables, the Ayans, began to exercise more control, treating their provinces like personal fiefdoms. What had once been a centralized system was slipping into a loose confederation of semi-autonomous territories, weakening the empire's unity. The 18th century was also an age of reform attempts, though most ended in frustration. Ottoman rulers recognized their disadvantages compared to Europe. Their armies were often less disciplined, their weapons outdated, their treasury overstretched. Some sultans, like Selim III, sought to modernize. Inspired by European models, Selim introduced the Nizam-i-Sedid, the New Order army, trained and equipped along Western lines. He sought to reform the bureaucracy, stabilize finances, and bring new life to a weary state. Yet reform was bitterly opposed by entrenched interests, particularly the Janissaries. Once an elite fighting corps, the Janissaries had become a powerful political force, resisting change that threatened their privileges. Time and again, reformers found themselves blocked, undermined, or even overthrown by the very institutions they sought to fix. Yet for all its troubles, Ottoman culture thrived in this period. Istanbul remained one of the great cities of the world, its mosques still magnificent, its markets alive with goods from Africa, Asia, and Europe. Poets, scholars, and architects continued to shape a civilization that was both deeply Islamic and profoundly cosmopolitan. In its palaces, music echoed through the halls. In its coffee houses, men gathered to share news, ideas, and debate the shifting fortunes of their empire. If the state was weakening, the culture it had nurtured remained vital. But shadows lengthened. Europe was entering the Enlightenment, an age of scientific advance, industrial beginnings, and political revolution. The Ottomans, by contrast, often struggled to absorb these currents. They looked west with both fascination and fear, sending envoys to Paris and London, translating foreign texts, and adopting bits of European fashion and technology. But deeper change proved elusive. For every step forward, there was resistance, hesitation, or reversal. The empire was caught between worlds, too modern to remain static, too burdened by tradition to transform fully. By the dawn of the 19th century, this tension had become acute. The French Revolution had shaken Europe, and Napoleon's campaigns carried its shockwaves to Ottoman shores. When Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, the Ottomans suddenly faced not just Russia or Austria, but a new kind of European power, revolutionary, aggressive, and global in ambition. Though the French were eventually driven out, the episode revealed just how vulnerable Ottoman territories had become. Egypt, the jewel of the Eastern Mediterranean, could be invaded almost at will. It was a sobering realization, one that cast a long shadow over the coming century. For as the 1800s began, the empire that had once called itself the refuge of the world, the house that Osman had built from a frontier principality into a dominion spanning 3 continents, now stood increasingly on the defensive. Its armies were battered, its provinces restless, its enemies relentless. From this moment onward, the story of the Ottomans would be less about expansion and triumph, and more about survival in a world remade by industrial revolutions, nationalism, and the rise of modern states. The 18th century had set the stage, and the 19th would play out its consequences. The 19th century dawned with the Ottoman Empire standing at a crossroads. Its past was immense centuries of conquest, of rulers who had commanded the allegiance of 3 continents. Yet its future now seemed clouded, its grip on power weakened by internal decay and external pressures. Europeans had begun to call it the sick man of Europe, a phrase that captured both its fragility and its looming irrelevance in the age of modern nation-states. And yet, the Ottomans endured. For over a century, they would struggle, adapt, and reform in an effort to reclaim their place in the world. The heart of this struggle was to reform the Tanzimat, or reorganization. Beginning in 1839 with the Hadi Sharif of Gulhain, the Sultan declared sweeping changes. These promised equality before the law for Muslims and non-Muslims alike, the abolition of arbitrary taxation, and the protection of life and property. The empire sought to centralize its administration, professionalize its army, and modernize its schools. Ottoman statesmen, often educated in both Islamic and European traditions, tried to weave together old and new, to preserve the empire while borrowing from the institutions of the West. But reform was never easy. It required money the treasury did not have, and discipline that the army no longer possessed. Provincial elites resisted the intrusion of central authority, while religious leaders warned that equal rights for Christians and Jews undermined the Islamic character of the state. Even as the Tanzimat decrees echoed through Istanbul's palaces, their effects often faltered in the provinces, where local realities overwhelmed lofty promises. The century also brought war after war, each one stripping away more of the empire's lands. The Crimean War of the 1850s was a moment of false hope. Facing Russian aggression, the Ottomans allied with Britain and France. Their victory, secured with Western help, briefly suggested that the empire might still hold its ground in Europe. But it came at a price. To finance the war, the Ottomans borrowed heavily from European creditors, entangling their finances with foreign banks. Debt mounted, and by the 1870s, the empire was effectively bankrupt, forced to accept European oversight of its revenues. Meanwhile, nationalism surged across the Balkans. For centuries, the Ottomans had ruled over a diverse mosaic of peoples: Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, Romanians, Armenians, Arabs, Kurds, and more. This diversity had once been a strength, managed through the millet system that allowed communities to govern their own affairs under Ottoman sovereignty. But in the 19th century, inspired by the ideals of independence and national identity sweeping across Europe, these communities began to rebel. Greece rose first, in a bloody struggle that culminated in independence in the 1820s. Serbs followed with their own uprisings. By mid-century, the Balkans were aflame with revolts, each one chipping away at Ottoman authority. The empire's European rivals eagerly fanned these flames. Russia claimed the role of protector of Orthodox Christians, using it as justification to interfere in Ottoman affairs. Britain and France, while wary of Russian expansion, also pressed the Ottomans to make concessions, often favoring Christian minorities over Muslim rulers. The Ottoman state found itself trapped in a web of foreign interventions, its sovereignty constantly undermined by the very powers that claimed to preserve it. Amid these crises, Istanbul itself transformed. The city became a laboratory of modernity and contradiction. New boulevards were cut through ancient quarters, Western fashions spread among the elite, and telegraphs and railways bound the empire closer to Europe. At the same time, poverty deepened in the countryside, peasants groaned under taxation, and villages were uprooted by war and migration. The empire was changing, but unevenly, and the gap between the capital and the provinces grew ever wider. The sultans of this age were figures caught between tradition and reform. Mehmed II, remembered as the reformer sultan, broke the power of the Janissaries in 1826, ending centuries of military dominance. His successors, Abdülmecid and Abdulaziz, pursued the Tanzimat, hoping to revive imperial strength. Yet their efforts often alienated conservatives without fully satisfying liberals. The empire seemed constantly in motion, yet always behind. By the late 19th century, a darker mood had settled. Sultan Abdülhamid II, who reigned from 1876 to 1909, abandoned many of the Tanzimat ideals in favor of authoritarian rule. Suspicious of constitutionalists and fearful of revolution, he dissolved parliament, and centralized power in his own hands. Yet he was not without vision. He invested in railways, telegraphs, and schools, and promoted a pan-Islamic ideology, presenting himself as the caliph of all Muslims, from Morocco to India. He sought to use Islam as a unifying force in an empire where nationalism threatened to tear it apart. But repression bred resentment. Dissidents fled abroad, forming opposition movements in Paris, London, and Cairo. Within the empire, secret societies flourished, dreaming of constitutional government and national renewal. The Young Turks, as they came to be known, grew increasingly bold, preparing the way for a dramatic revolution in the early 20th century. Through it all, the empire limped onward, never fully collapsing but never recovering its old strength. Its borders shrank, its debts deepened, its authority eroded. The 19th century had begun with hope of revival and ended with a state that many believed was living on borrowed time. Yet the Ottoman Empire endured. It had survived when many thought it would not. Its sultans still sat in Topkapi. Its call to prayer echoed from the minarets of Istanbul. Its armies still marched beneath the crescent. It was no longer the empire of Suleiman or Mehmed the Conqueror, but it was not yet gone. As the 19th century closed, the world stood on the brink of an even greater upheaval. The industrial might of Europe was reshaping global power, nationalism was hardening into militant ideologies, and alliances were forming that would soon plunge the world into war. For the Ottomans, the question was no longer how to reform, but how to survive what was coming. By the final decades of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer feared as the hammer of Islam or the terror of Europe. Instead, it was whispered about in the drawing rooms of London, St. Petersburg, Paris, and Vienna as the sick man of Europe. The phrase itself carried a cruel irony, for it suggested not only that the empire was dying, but that its decline had become a matter of curiosity, debate, and calculation among those who once trembled before its armies. To the European powers, the question was not if the Ottomans would collapse, but when and who would inherit the spoils when it did. The empire's decline was visible on every front. Territory bled away year after year, like sand slipping through an hourglass. Algeria had already been seized by the French in 1830. Tunisia fell in 1881, followed by Egypt, which slipped under British control in 1882. In North Africa, the Crescent Banner retreated before the tricolor and the Union Jack. To many observers, these lands were the first clear signs that Ottoman authority was not only weakening, but could no longer defend its own dominions from the predatory appetites of Europe. In the Balkans, the empire's wounds were deeper still. Serbia, Greece, Romania, and Bulgaria, once provinces where Ottoman soldiers had marched unopposed, were now independent states, some born in bloody revolt, others pried away by the interventions of Russia and Austria. The loss of these lands not only shrank the empire's borders, but gnawed at its very identity. For centuries, the Ottomans had been a European empire, their banners planted on the plains of Hungary, their armies camped beneath the walls of Vienna. Now they were being pushed back across the Danube, their European possessions reduced to a fragile strip of territory that seemed destined to vanish. Inside the empire, crises multiplied. The treasury groaned beneath crushing debts to European banks. To secure loans, Ottoman officials surrendered control over key revenues to the Public Debt Administration, an institution staffed largely by foreigners. Customs houses, salt taxes, and tobacco monopolies passed into European hands, symbols of a sovereignty that was steadily being hollowed out. Ordinary people felt the weight of these debts in the form of rising taxes and falling opportunities, fueling unrest in the villages and cities of Anatolia, the Balkans, and the Arab provinces. The very army that once ensured Ottoman dominance had been hollowed out by corruption and inefficiency. Attempts at modernization met fierce resistance from entrenched interests. Soldiers lacked adequate equipment, officers bickered over outdated methods, and the empire's military prestige dwindled. And yet, the Sultan still sought to maintain the illusion of strength, commissioning grand parades in Istanbul, even as foreign observers knew the reality. This was no longer the fearsome host that had once swept across continents. Amid this atmosphere of decline, Sultan Abdülhamid II tried to craft a new vision of survival. He turned away from the liberal ideals of the Tanzimat, suspending the constitution and dissolving parliament in 1878. Instead, he relied on autocratic rule, secret police, and tight censorship to maintain control. Yet Abdülhamid was not blind to the empire's vulnerabilities. He poured resources into modern infrastructure, railways, telegraphs, and schools, and championed the ideology of pan-Islamism, casting himself not just as Ottoman Sultan, but as Caliph of all Muslims. In theory, this appeal to the wider Islamic world was a masterstroke. It offered a new basis of legitimacy at a time when nationalism was tearing the empire apart, and it threatened the European powers who ruled over millions of Muslim subjects. But in practice, pan-Islamism could not halt the rising tide of separatism among Arabs, Armenians, and Kurds, nor could it reverse the advances of European imperialism. Abdülhamid's reign preserved the empire for a time, but it did so through repression rather than renewal, and its cracks only deepened beneath the surface. The empire's internal diversity, once managed through the millet system, has now become a source of strain. Armenians in eastern Anatolia demanded reforms to protect their communities from violence and discrimination. Their calls were met not with conciliation, but with massacres in the 1890s that shocked the world and stained the empire's reputation further. In Macedonia, Albanian, Bulgarian, and Greek nationalists organized guerrilla movements, fighting Ottoman garrisons in the mountains and valleys. Each rebellion chipped away at central authority, eroding confidence in the empire's ability to govern its peoples fairly. By the dawn of the 20th century, Ottoman intellectuals and dissidents had begun to coalesce into organized movements. Chief among them were the Young Turks, a group of reformers and exiles who dreamed of constitutional government and a rejuvenated state. From Paris, London, and Cairo, they wrote pamphlets, plotted conspiracies, and spread their ideas back into Anatolia. In 1908, their movement erupted into revolution. Garrison officers in Macedonia mutinied, demanding the restoration of the Constitution of 1876. Abdülhamid, facing overwhelming pressure, capitulated. For a moment, it seemed as though the empire had been reborn. Crowds cheered in the streets, journalists wrote of a second chance, and exiled intellectuals returned home to participate in a new era of constitutional government. Yet the optimism of 1908 soon dissolved into disappointment. The empire was now governed by the Committee of Union and Progress, dominated by the Young Turks, but unity proved elusive. Factions argued bitterly over the future direction of the state. Some sought to revive Ottomanism, a vision of shared loyalty across religious and ethnic lines. Others leaned toward pan-Islamism, while still others embraced an assertive Turkish nationalism. The empire, once united by conquest and faith, was now fractured by competing ideologies that threatened to pull it apart. Meanwhile, foreign threats mounted. Italy seized Libya in 1911, stripping away yet another province. In the following year, the Balkan League of Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, and Montenegro launched a joint assault on the empire. Ottoman armies, poorly led and badly supplied, collapsed in the face of this coordinated attack. In the First Balkan War, the empire lost nearly all of its remaining European territory, clinging only to a small foothold around Istanbul. For contemporaries, the humiliation was profound. What had once been the jewel of the empire, its European lands, its gateway to Constantinople, was now gone. The Second Balkan War, fought among the victors themselves, allowed the Ottomans to claw back a fragment of territory in Thrace. But the overall picture was unmistakable. The empire was no longer a great power. It was a battered relic, surviving not because of its strength, but because the great powers of Europe could not agree on how to divide it. And yet, for all its weakness, the Ottoman Empire endured. Its capital remained a city of millions, its sultan still wielded authority, its armies still patrolled vast provinces from the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of Anatolia. But the sense of inevitability hung heavy in the air. Diplomats in European capitals spoke of the Eastern Question, a phrase that captured both the empire's fragility and the geopolitical danger of its collapse. For Russia, it was a chance to expand southward and seize Constantinople. For Britain, it was about protecting the route to India and maintaining access to the Suez Canal. For Austria-Hungary, it was about suppressing nationalism in the Balkans. For France and Germany, it was about influence, railways, and spheres of control. The Ottoman Empire had once commanded the destiny of nations. Now, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it had become the object of their designs. Its survival no longer depended solely on its own strength, but on the rivalries of the powers circling it. Like vultures waiting for a wounded beast to collapse, they hovered, calculating, preparing. And in this fragile state, the empire stumbled into the 20th century, unaware that the coming storm would not merely wound it further, but bring its 600-year existence to a final, dramatic end. The year was 1914, and the Ottoman Empire, weakened but still standing, found itself at the edge of a world in flames. Across Europe, alliances hardened into battle lines, and an assassination in Sarajevo had set into motion events that would plunge the globe into its first truly modern war. For the Ottomans, this conflict seemed both a danger and an opportunity. Danger, because the empire was exhausted, its treasury drained, its armies battered by defeat in the Balkan Wars. Opportunity, because perhaps, just perhaps, aligning with the right side might restore its fading strength and recover the lands it had lost. The decision to join the Central Powers was not made lightly. Germany, with its industrial might and modern military, seemed a rising star compared to the exhausted empires of Britain and France. German officers were already training Ottoman armies, German engineers building Ottoman railways, German diplomats whispering promises of support. And so, in the autumn of 1914, the Ottomans cast their lot with Berlin and Vienna, entering a war they hoped would save them. The empire's leaders, known as the Young Turks, were not united in this gamble. Enver Pasha, ambitious and fiery, dreamed of restoring Ottoman prestige through bold victories. Talat Pasha, pragmatic and calculating, sought survival through ruthless efficiency. Semel Pasha, the third of the triumvirate, balanced between ambition and desperation. Together, they steered the empire into a storm far greater than they could control. The war soon reached every corner of Ottoman lands. In the east, armies clashed with Russia in the snowbound mountains of the Caucasus. Ottoman troops, poorly equipped and driven into the cold without proper supplies, suffered catastrophic losses at Sarikamish in 1914. Tens of thousands froze to death in the winter passes, a disaster that shattered illusions of easy victory. To the south, the empire faced the full weight of British power. In Mesopotamia, British forces pushed up the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, seeking oil and access to Persia. At Gallipoli, in 1915, the Allies attempted a bold strike to capture the Dardanelles, open the straits, and seize Istanbul itself. For months, Australian, New Zealand, British, and French troops fought on the rugged cliffs and beaches. Yet here, against the odds, the Ottomans held. Under the leadership of commanders like Mustafa Kemal, later known as Atatürk, they repelled the invaders with extraordinary tenacity. The victory at Gallipoli became a moment of pride, a rare glimmer of hope in a war otherwise filled with tragedy. But for every triumph, there were deeper wounds. In 1915, amid the chaos of war and fear of Armenian collaboration with advancing Russian forces, the Ottoman government ordered the mass deportation of Armenians from eastern Anatolia. Caravans of men, women, and children were driven into the deserts of Syria, where countless perished from starvation, disease, or massacre. The scale of this tragedy was immense, leaving a scar that endures to this day. For the empire, it was an attempt to eliminate a perceived internal threat. For the Armenians, it was a catastrophe on a civilizational scale. Elsewhere, rebellion brewed. In the Arabian Peninsula, Sharif Hussein of Mecca, encouraged and armed by the British, declared revolt in 1916. The Arab Revolt, immortalized in stories of guerrilla fighters and figures like T.E. Lawrence, tore at the empire's southern provinces. Arab tribes, once loyal to the Ottoman Caliph, now turned against Istanbul, seeking independence. Ottoman garrisons in Medina and Damascus fought stubbornly, but the desert slipped away. The empire's vast geography became its curse. From the Caucasus to Mesopotamia, from Palestine to the Arabian deserts, Ottoman armies were stretched thin, battered on all fronts by enemies more numerous, better supplied, and increasingly determined. The economy collapsed under the strain of war, cities starved, and villages emptied. The once proud capital of Istanbul endured food shortages and political unrest, its population weary of sacrifice. By 1917, the situation grew dire. British forces captured Baghdad in Mesopotamia and pushed through Palestine, eventually seizing Jerusalem. Russian armies advanced deep into Anatolia, though their revolution later forced them to retreat. The tide was turning against the Ottomans, and their hopes of restoring lost glory evaporated. The final blow came in 1918. Allied offensives overwhelmed Ottoman defenses in Palestine and Syria. Damascus fell, then Aleppo. The empire, already weakened by years of war and internal fracture, could no longer resist. On October 30th, 1918, the Ottomans signed the Armistice of Mudros, effectively ending their role in the conflict. The aftermath was grim. Allied troops occupied Istanbul. The empire's provinces were carved apart by the victors. Britain seized Palestine and Mesopotamia, France took Syria and Lebanon, Greece landed troops on the Aegean coast, and Italy eyed southwestern Anatolia. The Ottoman dynasty, which had ruled for more than 6 centuries, now seemed powerless, its authority reduced to shadows. For the people of the empire, the war was not just a geopolitical disaster, but a human catastrophe. Millions had died soldiers on frozen battlefields, villagers in scorched provinces, deported families lost in the desert. The empire had gambled everything on survival, and it had lost. And yet, amid the ruins, new forces stirred. From the ashes of defeat emerged leaders and movements that would not accept dismemberment. In Anatolia, Mustafa Kemal organized resistance, gathering soldiers, villagers, and nationalists under a new banner. The war had destroyed the Ottoman Empire, but it also prepared the ground for a new Turkish republic. For contemporaries, the collapse of the empire was staggering. A state that had once ruled from Budapest to Baghdad, from Algiers to Mecca, was gone in the space of 4 years. Its rulers exiled, its lands partitioned, its legacy stained by tragedy. But its end was not just the fall of a dynasty. It was the closing of a chapter in world history, the death of one of the great empires of the early modern age. The First World War did not just end the Ottoman Empire. It reshaped the Middle East, redrew borders, and sowed seeds of conflict that still echo into the present. The story of the Ottomans' final years is therefore not merely about decline and defeat, but about the transformation of the passage from an imperial world to one of nation-states, a shift whose consequences still shape the world today. The guns of the First World War fell silent in November 1918, but for the lands of the Ottoman Empire, the silence was not peace. It was the heavy stillness of collapse, of a world that had ended. 6 centuries of Ottoman rule had crumbled in the space of 4 years. The sultans, once masters of an empire stretching across 3 continents, now presided over a shadow. Allied troops marched through the streets of Istanbul. British warships lay anchored in the Bosphorus, their cannons aimed at the domes and minarets of the capital. The empire that had outlasted crusades, Mongol invasions, and centuries of shifting fortunes now seemed irretrievably broken. The victors wasted no time in dividing its remains. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed in 1920, was a death sentence. Anatolia itself was to be partitioned. Greece was granted Smyrna and parts of the Aegean coast. Italy claimed the southwest, while France laid hold of Cilicia. The British seized Mesopotamia and Palestine, and the French took Syria and Lebanon. Armenia was to be given independence, while the Kurds were promised their own state. Even Istanbul itself, the jewel of the empire, was placed under international supervision. To the outside world, the sick man of Europe had finally succumbed, carved into pieces by the powers that had long circled its carcass. For many Ottomans, this humiliation was unbearable. The dynasty of Osman, which had once crowned sultans as caliphs of Islam, now appeared as little more than puppets under Allied control. Sultan Mehmed VI, the last Ottoman ruler, clung to his throne, cooperating with the occupiers in the hope of preserving anything of the empire. But in the eyes of many, his compliance marked him not as a savior, but as a betrayer. It was in this moment of despair that a new figure rose from the ashes of defeat. Mustafa Kemal, the soldier who had stood firm at Gallipoli, now emerged as the voice of resistance. Unlike the sultans, he had no illusions of saving the empire in its old form. He saw, instead, a new path, one that abandoned the centuries-old dream of empire for the more modest, but perhaps more enduring, vision of a modern nation-state. From the town of Samsun on the Black Sea coast, in May 1919, Kemal began his campaign. Traveling inland to Amasya, Erzurum, and Sivas, he rallied support among disillusioned officers, local notables, and villagers weary of foreign occupation. He called for the defense of Anatolia itself, for the creation of a Turkish homeland free of foreign domination. His movement grew rapidly, gathering momentum as Allied demands and Greek advances inflamed nationalist anger. The struggle that followed was brutal and uncertain. Greek forces, supported by the Allies, pushed deep into Anatolia, advancing toward Ankara. Battles were fought across the plains of western Turkey, villages burned, populations scattered. In these desperate years, Mustafa Kemal and his followers organized what became known as the Turkish National Movement, uniting disparate groups under a common cause, to drive out the invaders and secure independence. The turning point came in 1921 at the Battle of Sakarya, where Kemal's forces halted the Greek advance. It was a battle fought not only with weapons, but with endurance, stretched across 22 days of relentless combat. The following year, the nationalists launched a counteroffensive, driving the Greeks back toward the coast. In 1922, at the Battle of Dumlupınar, the Greeks were decisively defeated. By the autumn, their armies were in retreat, Smyrna was recaptured, and the foreign dream of partitioning Anatolia lay in ruins. In the aftermath, the Allies were forced to negotiate. The Treaty of Lausanne, signed in 1923, replaced the hated Sèvres Agreement. It recognized the sovereignty of a new Turkish republic, centered not on the grandeur of empire, but on the independence of a nation. Istanbul was returned to Turkish control. The dreams of Armenian and Kurdish independence were quietly abandoned. For the first time in centuries, Anatolia would be ruled not as the heart of an empire, but as the homeland of a modern state. For the Ottoman dynasty, this was the end. In November 1922, Sultan Mehmed VI fled Istanbul aboard a British warship, the last of his line to sit upon the throne. The caliphate itself lingered for a time, a hollow symbol stripped of real power, until Mustafa Kemal, now Atatürk, abolished it in 1924. The empire of the sultans, of janissaries and viziers, of conquests and caliphs, was no more. What followed was a revolution not of expansion, but of transformation. Atatürk set about remaking Turkey in the image of modernity. The Ottoman script was abandoned for a Latin alphabet. Religious courts and schools were replaced by secular institutions. Fez hats gave way to Western dress. The caliphate, once the unifying symbol of the Islamic world, was dissolved in favor of a strictly national identity. For Atatürk, survival lay not in clinging to the past, but in breaking with it. Yet the legacy of the Ottoman Empire did not vanish with its fall. Its memory lingers in the cities it once built, in the mosques and palaces that still dominate the skylines of Istanbul, Sarajevo, Damascus, and Cairo. Its influence endures in the political struggles of the Middle East, in the borders drawn in its wake, and in the unresolved tensions it left behind. The fall of the Ottomans was not simply the end of an empire. It was the beginning of a new world order, whose consequences are still felt today. The story of the Ottoman Empire is therefore not one of mere decline. It is the story of a civilization that rose from the frontier lands of Anatolia, conquered Constantinople, and ruled for centuries as one of the great powers of the world. It is the story of a state that adapted, survived, and transformed, even as the tides of history shifted against it. And it is the story of its end, a reminder that no empire, no matter how vast or enduring, is immune to the forces of change. As the 20th century began, the Ottoman Empire was gone. In its place stood the Republic of Turkey, a nation forged in struggle, stripped of empire, but burning with the determination to survive. The Ottomans had entered history as conquerors. They left it as a memory, a legacy, and a warning. And so, from the frontier warriors of Osman to the reformers of Ataturk, the arc of Ottoman history stretches across 7 centuries, rising, flourishing, and finally collapsing, leaving behind not only ruins but a profound imprint upon the world. Their story, like all great empires, is not just about power gained or lost, but about the human lives lived within it, the builders and rulers, the soldiers and rebels, the farmers and merchants, the families who called its lands home. It is in their memory that the Ottoman Empire endures not as a political force, but as a chapter in the ongoing story of human civilization.